After Artemis II came back to Earth, Christina Koch walked up to Orion and hugged it. Not because someone asked her to, not because it was a perfect machine, because for 9 days that small capsule had been home. It had carried 4 astronauts around the moon and brought them back alive. It had also carried something quieter: names, memories, love. NASA called Artemis II a test flight. It was, but by the time Orion touched the ocean again, the mission had become something more personal. It was not only about going back to the moon, it was about who we carry with us when we go. Before launch, the Artemis II crew had to do something that sounds small until you imagine yourself in their place. They had to name the spacecraft that would keep them alive. Not the program, not the rocket. The actual ship, the room they would sleep in, work in, trust, and bet their lives on. On September 24, 2025, the crew named Orion Integrity. NASA said the name embodied trust, respect, candor, and humility. It also pointed to the scale of the effort behind the mission. More than 300,000 spacecraft components and thousands of people across the world had to come together for one safe trip around the moon and back. That is a very revealing choice. They did not choose a name that sounded aggressive. They did not choose a name that sounded invincible. They chose a word that only matters when things get difficult: integrity. Then NASA opened the mission to the public in a simple way. People could submit names through the Send Your Name with Artemis II campaign and download a boarding pass as a keepsake. And here is the detail people keep asking about. Those names were not painted on the outside of the spacecraft. They were not hidden somewhere on the rocket. NASA said the collected names were put on an SD card loaded aboard Orion before launch. So, if someone entered the name of a parent, a partner, a child, or a friend, that name rode inside Orion itself. Inside the same spacecraft as Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen. That changes the emotional scale of the mission. Artemis II was still a hard engineering test, but it also became something else. A crewed spacecraft carrying the names of people back on Earth. And from the start, that gave the mission quite a meaning. It was not only about going far, it was about showing exactly who you carry with you. The sentimental part of Artemis II only works because the technical part was so unforgiving. This mission had to prove Orion could keep a crew alive far beyond low Earth orbit. Reid Wiseman, the commander, had already spent 165 days on the International Space Station. Victor Glover, the pilot, was a naval aviator, test pilot, and veteran of Crew 1. Christina Koch, mission specialist, had already spent 328 consecutive days in space and joined the first all-female spacewalks. Jeremy Hansen, also a mission specialist, was a former fighter pilot and became the first Canadian assigned to fly around the moon. On the 1st of April 2026 at 6:35 p.m. EDT, they launched from Launch Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center. Below them was NASA's Space Launch System, pushing more than 8.8 million pounds of thrust. This was the first time humans had ever flown on that rocket and in that spacecraft. Within minutes, Orion reached space, deployed its solar arrays, and began the first checks that mattered. The mission profile was designed to stay close to Earth at first. Orion and the interim cryogenic propulsion stage orbited Earth twice. The spacecraft moved from an early elliptical orbit into a high Earth orbit stretching roughly 46,000 miles beyond Earth. That first day was not about spectacle, it was about systems. The crew checked life support to make sure Orion could generate breathable air. They tested navigation and communications, including an early checkout of the deep space network once Orion briefly moved beyond the usual range of GPS and NASA's tracking and data relay satellites. They also flew a manual proximity operations demonstration around the upper stage, practicing the kind of piloting future crews will need for rendezvous and docking in lunar orbit. Only after all of that did Mission Control clear Orion for the burn that actually sent them away. On April 2, Orion's European-built service module fired its main engine for about 6 minutes. That was the translunar injection burn. Technically, it was one propulsion event. Emotionally, it was the moment Earth stopped being beneath them and started becoming the place behind them. From there, Artemis II entered the free return path that traced a giant figure 8 around the moon and set up a natural trip home. Now the mission was no longer a rehearsal near Earth, it was a real lunar voyage. After leaving Earth orbit, Artemis II took about 4 days to reach the moon. At 12:56 p.m. CDT, the crew passed Apollo 13's long-standing distance record for human spaceflight, crossing 248,655 miles from Earth. At the mission's farthest point, Orion carried them about 252,756 miles from home. Soon after, the spacecraft came within about 4,067 miles of the lunar surface at closest approach. That is far higher than an Apollo-style low pass. But it was still close enough for the moon to stop looking like a symbol and start looking like terrain. Crater rims, ancient lava flows, fractures, long shadows along the terminator. From Orion's windows, the moon could look as large as a basketball held at arm's length, with Earth hanging far beyond it. Then came the part that still feels almost impossible. As Orion moved behind the moon, NASA expected to lose communication for about 40 minutes while the moon blocked the signal path through the deep space network. For that stretch, there was no direct line home. The crew kept working anyway. They photographed the far side. They watched a solar eclipse from Orion's point of view. During the lunar flyby, they captured more than 7,000 images of the lunar surface, Earthrise, Earthset, and the strange textures of a world humans had not seen up close in more than 50 years. And then came the most intimate detail of the entire flight. During the mission, the crew proposed names for 2 lunar craters. One honored their spacecraft integrity. The other honored Wiseman's late wife, Carol. NASA said those proposals would be formally submitted to the International Astronomical Union. That one fact changes how you hear the whole story. Even at record distance, even inside a mission built around engineering data, the crew still carried private grief and private love with them. Jeremy Hansen later described the return in a line that captured the whole emotional geometry of Artemis II. He said the crew would continue even farther into space before Mother Earth succeeds in pulling us back to everything that we hold dear. That is not the language of cold missionary. That is the language of people who know exactly what home means.
And the second one, and especially meaningful for this crew, is a number of years ago we started this journey in our close-knit astronaut family, and we lost a loved one. And there's a feature in a really neat place on the moon, and it is on the near side, far side boundary. In fact, it's just on the near side of that boundary, and so at certain times of the moon's transit around Earth, we will be able to see this from Earth. And so we lost a loved one. Her name was Carol, the spouse of Reid, the mother of Katie and Ellie. And if you want to find this one, you look at Glushko, and it's just to the northwest of that, at the same latitude as Ohm, and it's a bright spot on the moon. And we would like to call it Carol, and you spell that Carroll.
Integrity and Carroll Crater. Loud and clear. Thank you.
The brilliance of Artemis II is that the mission was never just about getting to the moon. It was about proving Orion could bring its crew back alive. After the flyby, the spacecraft followed its free return path home, using the Earth-Moon gravity field instead of a major return burn. Along the way, the crew continued testing systems, including more manual piloting work and radiation shielding demonstrations, while small trajectory correction burns kept Orion lined up for re-entry. Then came the hardest physical part of the mission. 5 hours before entry interface on flight day 10, the crew began the final checklist. The service module separated, exposing Orion's heat shield. At about 400,000 feet above Earth, the crew module began feeling the atmosphere again. Within seconds, superheated plasma built up around the spacecraft. Orion faced temperatures of around 3000 degrees Fahrenheit. Communications were temporarily blocked. Then the parachute sequence began. 2 to 3 foot drogue parachutes came out first. At 9,500 feet, pilot parachutes pulled out the 3 enormous 116-foot main parachutes. Those mains slowed Orion from about 130 miles per hour to about 17 miles per hour for splashdown. Once in the water, 5 orange airbags inflated around the top of the capsule so it could be righted if needed. At 5:07 p.m. PDT on the 10th of April 2026, Orion splashed down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego. The mission had lasted 9 days, 1 hour, and 32 minutes. The crew had flown 694,481 miles. Recovery teams met the astronauts in open water, helped them out of Orion, and took them by helicopter to the USS John P. Murtaugh for initial medical evaluations. And that is where the image at the center of the story happened. On April 11, Christina Koch hugged Orion in the ship's well deck. By then, the capsule was blackened from re-entry. The test was over. The crew was safe. And suddenly, the whole mission looked different. Not like a publicity image, like a person saying thank you to the machine that brought them home. Artemis II mattered because it proved hardware, but it will be remembered because it revealed people. It showed 4 astronauts trusting a spacecraft called Integrity. It showed NASA putting public names on an SD card aboard Orion before launch, letting ordinary people send a piece of someone they love around the moon. It showed a crew honoring Carol in the middle of a lunar flyby, reminding everyone that exploration never becomes less human just because it becomes more advanced. And it ended with a hug that explained the mission better than any slogan could. Deep space flight looks like metal, fire, equations, and risk. But at the center of it, the reason people go is still very old. They go carrying memory. They go carrying other people. They go carrying love. Artemis II did not land on the moon. It did something harder for a first step. It made the return to the moon feel personal. If you could send one name around the moon, would you choose your own, or someone whose name deserves to travel farther than they ever could?